The year is 1945. The location is the Netherlands. The landscape is a freezing, muddy hellscape that has swallowed entire battalions. By this stage of the Second World War, the German Wehrmacht is crumbling, yet they remain a lethal, cornered animal. They are fighting for every dike, every windmill, and every ruined farmhouse. On the other side of the line, facing them, are the Canadians, specifically the 1st Canadian Army. By this point in the war, the Germans had developed a specific, begrudging respect for the soldiers from the Great White North. In captured German intelligence reports, Canadian infantry were often described as stormtroopers, aggressive, unyielding, and particularly skilled in the chaos of close-quarters trench raiding. But among these thousands of soldiers, one name has risen above the rest to become a modern legend. You have likely seen the headlines, the YouTube thumbnails, and the viral articles. They speak of a man who was a one-man army, a soldier who liberated an entire city by himself, a warrior who lost an eye but refused to go home, a man named Leo Major. The popular narrative tells us that Leo Major was so terrifying that the mere whisper of his name sent shivers down the spine of the Nazi high command. It suggests a boogeyman status that rivals fiction. But today, we are going to do something different. We are going to strip away the internet hyperbole and look at the cold, hard military reality. We need to ask the difficult question: did the German army actually know who Leo Major was? Is there a dossier in a dusty Berlin archive stamped urgent with his name on it? Or was the fear he generated something more primal, more local, and ultimately more realistic? The truth is, Leo Major is the only soldier in the British Commonwealth to receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal, DCM, in 2 separate wars, World War II and the Korean War. That is a fact. It is a statistical anomaly that suggests he wasn't just lucky, he was terrifyingly competent. But the idea that he was a celebrity among the Nazis, that is likely a myth. The reality, however, might be even more impressive. The Germans didn't need to know his name to fear him. When a patrol vanishes into the night without a sound, or when a sniper shot takes out a commander from a mile away, you don't fear a name. You fear the invisible presence in the dark. You fear the Canadian sniper. You fear the Phantom. This is not a story about a superhero. This is the story of a soldier from Quebec, a man of flesh and blood, who mastered the art of violence so thoroughly that history mistook him for a myth. This is the true story of Leo Major. To understand why a man would run toward machine gun fire when everyone else is taking cover, we have to look at where he came from. Heroes, or perhaps more accurately warriors, are rarely born in comfort. They are forged in conflict. Leo Major was born on January 23, 1921, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to French-Canadian parents. But his story truly begins when the family moved back north, settling in Montreal, Quebec. This was the Great Depression. It was a time of scarcity, hunger, and hard edges. The young Leo was not a model citizen. He was described by those who knew him as volatile, fiercely independent, and possessing a temper that could flare up like a match in a gas station. His relationship with his father was catastrophic. It wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was a fundamental clash of wills. The tension in the Major household became so unbearable that Leo, while still practically a child, left home. He moved in with an aunt, taking on hard labor jobs to survive. This period of his life is crucial to understanding the soldier he became. He learned early on that relying on authority figures, like his father, resulted in pain. He learned that the only person he could trust to keep him safe, or to get him fed, was himself. He developed a stubbornness that bordered on pathology. If you told Leo Major to go left, he would go right, just to prove he could survive the journey. In 1940, with the world on fire, Leo Major enlisted. He joined Le Régiment de la Chaudière, a French-Canadian infantry unit from Quebec. Later, This regiment would become famous as the only French-Canadian unit to participate in the D-Day landings at Juno Beach. But why did he join? It wasn't necessarily for king and country. For many young men of that era, the Army offered 3 meals a day and a pair of boots, luxuries during the Depression. But for Leo, it offered something else, a channel for his aggression. In basic training, it became immediately apparent that Private Major was not designed for the parade square. He wasn't good at standing still and polishing brass buttons. He was, however, exceptional at fieldcraft. He had the eyes of a hawk and the stamina of a wolf. He moved quietly. He understood terrain instinctively. The Army, in its wisdom, recognized that a soldier with high aggression and low regard for authority makes a terrible garrison trooper, but an excellent scout. They funneled him into the role of a sniper and reconnaissance specialist. This distinction is vital. A regular infantryman fights as part of a platoon, a cog in a machine, following orders and moving in formation. A scout, however, operates in the gray zones. They work ahead of the main force. They work in small teams or alone. They are the eyes and ears of the Army, operating in the no-man's land between safety and death. It was the perfect job for a loner. It legitimized his need to be independent, and most importantly, it placed him in situations where there were rarely witnesses to his actions. This is the breeding ground of legends. When you operate in the shadows, destroying enemy positions before vanishing, the enemy doesn't see a regiment, they see a ghost. And the ghost of Leo Major was just beginning to take shape. Normandy, June 1944. On June 6, 1944, history held its breath. The Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Among the thousands of landing craft churning through the gray Atlantic waves toward Juno Beach were the men of Le Régiment de la Chaudière. Leo Major was among them. The landing was a chaotic symphony of artillery fire, diesel fumes, and shouting men. While many froze in the face of the Atlantic Wall's defenses, Leo Major found his element. He didn't just survive the beach, he immediately began to work. In the confused days following D-Day, as the Allies tried to break out of the Normandy beachheads, Leo proved that his rebellious streak was actually a tactical asset. During a reconnaissance mission, he spotted a German Hanomag, an armored half-track, moving alone. Most soldiers would have radioed it in or let it pass. Leo attacked. He ambushed the vehicle single-handedly, capturing it intact. But the prize wasn't the machine. It was the cargo. Inside, intelligence officers found detailed German codebooks and communication logs. It was a massive intelligence coup for the Canadians. Leo had effectively blinded the local German command before the battle truly began. But war exacts a price for such boldness. A few days later, Leo was scouting ahead of his unit when he encountered a patrol of 4 SS soldiers. The Waffen-SS were the elite, fanatical arm of the Nazi war machine, feared for their brutality. For Leo, they were just targets. A firefight erupted. Leo moved with the speed that would become his trademark, killing all 4 SS troopers. However, in the dying moments of the skirmish, one of the Germans managed to detonate a phosphorus grenade. White phosphorus is a horrific weapon. It burns upon contact with air and sticks to skin like napalm. The explosion didn't kill Leo, but it seared his face and critically damaged his left eye. He was rushed to a field hospital. The doctors took one look at the damage and made the logical military decision. Private Major was done. He was to be tagged WIA, Wounded in Action, and shipped back to England and then to Canada. The war was over for him. Leo Major's reaction to this news has become one of the most famous anecdotes in Canadian military history. He didn't thank the doctors. He didn't feel relief. He felt insulted. He stood up, bandaged and bleeding, and told the medical officer that he wasn't going anywhere. He argued, with a logic that only makes sense to a sniper, that he sighted his rifle with his right eye. His left eye, he claimed, was redundant. "I don't need it to kill Nazis," he reportedly said. It was an act of supreme insubordination, but it was also an act of supreme will. He effectively walked out of the hospital and returned to his unit. He wore an eye patch, looking like a pirate in olive drab, and resumed his duties. This is the moment the man began to fade, and the myth began to form. To the Germans fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, he was just another enemy soldier. But to the men of his regiment, he was becoming a totem of invincibility. If a man could lose an eye and refuse to go home, what excuse did anyone else have to give up? By late 1944, the war had moved from the hedgerows of France to the flooded, freezing lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands. The Allies had a supply problem. They had captured the massive port of Antwerp, but they couldn't use it because the Germans controlled the Scheldt estuary, the river leading to the sea. The task of clearing this heavily fortified, waterlogged death trap fell to the Canadians. The Battle of the Scheldt would go down as one of the most miserable, grinding campaigns of the entire war. The terrain was a nightmare. The Germans had flooded the fields, turning the battlefield into a soup of freezing mud and hidden mines. Soldiers called it the drowning land. Tanks sank. Men got trench foot. And death came from nowhere. The Germans here were dug in deep. They knew the terrain, and they knew the Canadians were coming. German intelligence reports from this sector speak of a growing dread regarding the Canadian infantry. They were nicknamed water rats by some, soldiers who seemed capable of fighting in amphibious conditions that would stall other armies. Leo Major, now the one-eyed scout, thrived in this misery. The conditions favored the predator. The rain and darkness masked his movement. He continued his private war, conducting solo patrols, snatching prisoners for interrogation, and disrupting German supply lines. But the Scheldt had one more test for him. During a heavy engagement, a Bren gun carrier, a small armored transport, struck a mine. The explosion was catastrophic. Leo was thrown into the air, landing with a sickening crunch. His back was broken in 3 places. He had 4 broken ribs and 2 fractured ankles. Once again, he was carried to a field hospital. Once again, the doctors told him the war was over. A broken back is not a debate. It is a ticket home, usually in a wheelchair. They placed him in a body cast, immobilized. But they underestimated the sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness of Leo Major. He lay in that bed, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, thinking about his friends dying in the mud without him. Weeks later, he managed to get the cast removed. The doctors warned him that returning to the front would likely cripple him for life or kill him. Leo didn't care. He managed to secure a ride from a passing jeep and, incredibly, deserted from the hospital to the front lines. He rejoined Le Régiment de la Chaudière just as they were preparing for the final push into the Netherlands. He was in constant pain. He had one eye. His back was held together by little more than scar tissue and adrenaline. Why did the Germans fear the Canadians in the Scheldt? It wasn't because of a specific name like Major. It was because they were fighting an enemy that simply would not stop. An enemy that broke its back and came back for more. Leo Major was the personification of that relentless Canadian spirit. And he would need every ounce of that spirit for what was coming next. The regiment was moving toward a medieval city called Zwolle, and for the first time in his life, Leo Major was about to fight a battle that would put his name in the history books forever. April 13, 1945. This is the night that defines the man. This is the event that historians, soldiers, and storytellers have argued over for decades. The liberation of Zwolle. By April 1945, the Canadian Army was pushing into the province of Overijssel. Standing in their way was Zwolle, a picturesque medieval city with a population of about 50,000. For the commanding officer of Le Régiment de la Chaudière, the situation was a tactical nightmare. The city was garrisoned by German troops. Standard military doctrine dictated a heavy artillery barrage to soften up the defenses, followed by a tank and infantry assault. But artillery is a blunt instrument. It destroys buildings and kills civilians indiscriminately. The Canadians wanted to avoid turning Zwolle into a graveyard. They needed to know exactly how many Germans were left and where they were dug in. So, they called for volunteers. 2 hands went up. Private Leo Major and his best friend, Corporal Wilfred Arsenault. Their mission was strictly reconnaissance. Go in, they were told. Contact the Dutch resistance. Assess the enemy strength. Get out. They were not ordered to liberate the city. That would have been suicide. At dusk, Leo and Willie moved out. They slipped past the German outposts on the outskirts of the city. But luck, which had favored Leo for so long, finally ran out. A German patrol spotted them near a railway track. Flares went up. Machine gun fire ripped through the silence. Wilfred Arsenault was hit. He died there in the grass, just miles from the end of the war. Leo Major was now alone. He was alone in enemy territory, outnumbered by a garrison of German soldiers, with his best friend dead at his feet. At this moment, most soldiers would have retreated. The mission was compromised. The element of surprise was gone. Protocol demanded he return to lines and report. But Leo Major did not operate on protocol. He operated on rage. According to accounts he gave later, something snapped. But it wasn't a hot, blinding rage that makes a man reckless. It was a cold, calculating fury. He decided that the Germans would pay for Willie. Not just the soldier who fired the shot, but the entire garrison. He decided he wasn't going to scout the city. He was going to take it. This is where the reality of Leo Major separates from the Rambo myth. He didn't just run in shooting. He used psychological warfare. He knew that the German morale was brittle. They were tired. They knew the war was lost, and they were terrified of being surrounded. Leo's first move was to capture a German driver and his vehicle. But instead of killing him, Leo used him. He forced the driver to take him to a local bar where a German officer was drinking. Inside, Leo disarmed the officer. He found out the man spoke French. This was the key. Leo began to talk. He didn't shout. He spoke with the terrifying confidence of a man holding all the cards. He lied. He told the officer that the Canadian artillery began firing at dawn. He told him that a massive Canadian force, hundreds of men, tanks, flamethrowers, was already encircling the city. He offered the officer a choice: evacuate your men now and live, or stay and be buried under the rubble of this city. Then, Leo did the unthinkable. He let the officer go. He gave him his weapon back and told him to go warn his superiors. Why? Because Leo Major knew that fear spreads faster than fire. He needed that officer to go back to headquarters and spread the panic. He needed the Germans to believe the huge Canadian force was real. Once the officer left, Leo began his performance. For the next several hours, he ran through the darkened streets of Zwolle like a man possessed. He applied a tactic known in military terms as force multiplication. He would sprint to one neighborhood, throw a handful of grenades, and fire his Sten gun in long, loud bursts. Then, he would sprint to a different district and do it again. He raided German machine gun nests, attacking from the rear. He would capture groups of terrified soldiers, sometimes 10 or 15 at a time. But he couldn't guard them. So he marched them out of the city limits, handed them over to the stunned Canadian units waiting on the perimeter, and then, incredibly, he ran back into the city to get more. He did this 4 times. Inside the city, chaos reigned. The German High Command in Zwolle was receiving reports of attacks from the north, south, east, and west simultaneously. The officer Leo had released was likely screaming that the entire Canadian army had infiltrated the city. The grenades, the fires Leo started at the Gestapo headquarters, the constant movement. It all confirmed the lie. The Germans, fearing encirclement, began to pull out. So, let's answer the central question. Was Nazi Germany terrified of Leo Major? The soldiers in Zwolle that night didn't know his name. They didn't know it was one man with one eye and a broken back. If they had known, they would have simply swarmed him. A single soldier, no matter how skilled, cannot hold off a battalion that knows the truth. The fear they felt was the fear of the unknown. Leo Major weaponized the darkness. He weaponized their own exhaustion and defeatism. He became a projection of their worst nightmares, the overwhelming force of the Allies closing in. They didn't run because they were cowards. They ran because Leo Major made them believe that staying meant certain death against a superior force. He outsmarted them before he outfought them. By 4 a.m., the shooting stopped. The last German trucks rumbled out of the city. Leo Major, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, found the body of his friend Willie. He retrieved the corporal's body, fulfilling a silent promise. When the sun rose over Zwolle on April 14, 1945, there was no artillery barrage. There were no tanks crushing the cobblestones. There was just silence. The citizens of Zwolle began to emerge from their cellars. They expected to see ruins. Instead, they saw their city intact. And walking down the street was a single Canadian soldier, carrying his submachine gun, his eye patch dark against his pale face. He radioed back to his regiment. "The Germans are gone. You can come in now." When the details of that night reached the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Leo was nominated for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, or DCM. It was the second highest award for gallantry in the British Commonwealth, just below the Victoria Cross. But here, the rebels surfaced again. Leo Major reportedly declined the medal initially because he considered Montgomery incompetent. He only accepted his medals later. He didn't fight for the brass. He fought for Willie. And he fought because it was the only thing he knew how to do. The liberation of Zwolle remains one of the most singular feats of arms in World War II. But it wasn't magic. It was a masterclass in infantry tactics, endurance, and psychological manipulation. Leo Major didn't just defeat the enemy's body, he broke their mind. The Quiet Years and the Second War. After the war, the ghost of Zwolle vanished. Leo Major returned to Montreal. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He simply went back to work. He became a pipe fitter, a job that required hard labor and offered zero glory. For a few years, the man who had liberated a city single-handedly was just another face in the crowd, struggling to make ends meet, raising a family in anonymity. But peace didn't sit well with Leo Major. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. The Canadian Army needed experienced NCOs. Leo, despite his age, his missing eye, and his broken back, re-enlisted. He joined the Royal 22 Regiment, the famous Vendus. If anyone doubted that the events in Zwolle were real, if anyone thought Leo was just lucky, Korea silenced them forever. In November 1951, Leo found himself at the base of Hill 355. Soldiers called it Little Gibraltar because of its strategic importance. It was being held by an American division, but a massive Chinese assault overran the position. The Americans were forced to retreat, leaving the hill in enemy hands. Leo was ordered to retake it. He didn't have a battalion. He had a scout platoon of about 18 men. Under the cover of darkness, repeating the tactics he honed in the Netherlands, Leo infiltrated the Chinese positions. He didn't just retake the hill, he held it. For 3 days, his tiny unit repelled counterattack after counterattack. The Chinese army threw 2 entire divisions at Hill 355. Leo Major, the one-eyed commander, stood his ground. He called down mortar fire so close to his own position that the commander on the other end of the radio asked if he was trying to kill himself. Leo reportedly replied, "Just drop it where I tell you." When the smoke cleared, Hill 355 was Canadian. For this action, Leo Major was awarded his second Distinguished Conduct Medal. He is the only Canadian in history to receive this honor in 2 different wars, a hero in 2 nations. Leo survived Korea. He returned to Quebec and lived out the rest of his life quietly. For decades, his neighbors had no idea that the gruff old man living next door was a legend. But in Zwolle, they never forgot. To the people of that Dutch city, Leo Major was not a myth. He was their savior. Every year, on the anniversary of their liberation, the children of Zwolle are taught his name. There is a Leo Majorlaan, Leo Major Avenue, in the city. In his later years, Leo returned to Zwolle. The man who had once stalked those streets with a submachine gun, terrifying the German garrison, was now welcomed with parades and tears. He was named an honorary citizen. For Leo, this was the only validation that mattered. He didn't fight for the generals. He fought for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. The truth about the fear. So, we return to the question that started this journey. How terrified was Nazi Germany when they heard his name? If we look for a document in the Berlin archives, a most wanted list signed by Hitler with Leo Major's name on it, we won't find it. The Nazi regime, as a bureaucratic machine, was concerned with industrial output, strategic bombing, and the Red Army closing in from the east. They did not fear one Canadian corporal. But history isn't just written in the archives of the High Command. It is written in the mud of the Scheldt and the cobblestones of Zwolle. Did the entire German army fear him? No. They didn't know who he was. But did the German soldiers facing him fear him? Absolutely. The terror Leo Major inflicted was tactical, immediate, and visceral. It was the terror of a sentry standing in the dark, knowing that a Canadian phantom was out there. It was the panic of a garrison commander realizing his perimeter had been breached by a force he couldn't see. We often try to turn our war heroes into superheroes. We want to believe they were 10 feet tall and bulletproof. But the truth about Leo Major is far more compelling. He was a man. A difficult, stubborn, rebellious man from Quebec. He was a man who lost an eye and kept aiming. He was a man who broke his back and kept walking. Nazi Germany didn't need to know his name to be defeated by him. They just needed to get out of his way. And on one cold night in April 1945, that is exactly what they did.